Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here this morning. And I would like to talk about turning crisis into opportunities in our little garden in the state of Israel. I want to start with a puzzle, because 65, 62 years ago, Israel was founded as a Jewish state. And this was the culmination of a very long process, starting with the Zionist movement, which was the movement to liberate Jews and to help them exercise their right to self-determination. And the recognition that this indeed what Zionism was, that the culmination of the effort was a Jewish state, was recognized by the international community when the British mandate was established in Israel in 1917. And it was recognized in the Peel Commission in 1937, and it was definitely recognized by the UNSCOP decision in 1947 in the resulting partition decision of the United Nations in 29th November 1947. Israel was then defined as a Jewish state, and Jewish was not put against Christian or Muslim. Jewish was put as against Arab, because the perception of the history was that there was here a conflict between two movements of national liberation. One is a movement that started and developed at the end of colonialism and the British mandate. Another interesting, unique movement that brought back into the land of Israel the people who did not have political independence in any other place in the world but this one. And the conflict between these two national movements resulted in the need to give each of these peoples a place of their own. This was the idea, and despite the fact that the Arabs persistently worked against it and thought it was not just, this was not merely something that Jews wanted to do. This was something that was established by the decision of the international community. In fact, the Jewish state was indeed founded, but not only because of the resolution in 47, but also because the Arabs refused to accept that resolution, went to war, lost the war, and as a result, the Jewish state in part of Palestine was established, whereas the Arab state, the Palestinian state in part of Palestine, was not established, and it was divided between Jordan, the West Bank, and Egypt as military occupation in the Gaza Strip. Why is this history relevant when we are talking about the future, the tomorrow? This is the past. It's usual that it's impossible to say something meaningful about the future without understanding the past and the future. But here what we have is a very interesting development under which, a very short time after those events, we have claims that the whole project was born in sin, totally misguided, unjustified, delegitimate, a form of colonialism and racism, and if not militarily vanquished and wiped out of the map, as some members of the United Nations say, at least should, for sake of justice and human rights, give up its nature as the nation state of Jews. I think this is the demonization, the delegitimation that go with these is at the range and the magnitude of a crisis. And I think it's very important that we try to make this into an opportunity, simply because one of the good things about crisis is that when you have a crisis, you understand that it's not luxurious to deal with something. A crisis means that the stakes are high. And if you don't act, you don't identify the problem, and you don't transcend differences in order to deal with the major challenge ahead, you may be in trouble. And I think this indeed is the case for both Israel and the very, very important questions about Judaism and Zionism that Israel came to respond to and now exhibits and reflect. And I want to argue very quickly that Zionism was an attempt to respond to very deep needs of Jews as individuals and the Jewish people as a group. The State of Israel is the culmination of Zionism. To some extent, the reasons that made Zionism just are gone. We now have a state. We didn't have it before. But in many other senses, the reasons that we had for having a Jewish state are not only as valid now as they were there, they're in some ways even more valid. And they are complex and go to the most fundamental questions of the identity of the state, the identity of Jews and the Jewish people, and the future of both the State of Israel as a Jewish nation state and of the Jewish people. Why are these connected? Because Zionism, which was never a majority movement within Judaism, was a response to a number of distinct issues for Jews and Judaism. One, very, very important one, was persecution and pogroms and discrimination and exclusion and ultimately extermination. Now, the problem of persecuted Jews, the problem of excluded Jews, was a problem that applied to all Jews irrespective of how Jewish they were, how religious they were, what kind of religiosity they had, were they modern or not. All Jews were vulnerable to these attacks. So the idea of a Jewish state as a safe haven for Jews was an idea that was relevant for all forms of Jewish life. A second element of Zionism was the understanding that Jewish life in the diaspora, in exile, in places, some good, some bad, in which Jews were always a minority, being hosted by other communities and dependent on them for their safety and for their welfare, led to an unnormal existence for Jews. They didn't take responsibility for the whole spectrum of life. They were relegated only to a few occupations. In some of them they excelled, but they didn't have the kind of natural history of a people who shares responsibility for all aspects of their life, starting from working the land, doing all artisanship, doing economics, doing banking, fighting for your country. And people felt that there was a need to revive Jewish life and make it more complete, less narrow, less impoverished. And this again was a vision that held sway for both religious and non-religious Jews, and they wanted to form a full normal Jewish life in a place where Jews were a majority on a land which would be a Jewish land. And the third element is a cultural identity. Because Jews, for many, many generations, remained Jewish mainly by remaining observant. But with Enlightenment and secularism, the challenge within Judaism about the identity of Jewish identity became quite big. And the question for Jews who did not want to exhaust their Judaism by being observant remained critical. And Zionism became the answer for two types of these kinds of Jews. One is the types of maskilim, the people who did not want to assimilate to begin with. They insisted on not being excluded from Judaism just because they decided that observance was not the only way to be Jewish, and they insisted on enlarging Judaism and incorporating it as a culture and civilization, owing much to religion in terms of history, but not exhausted by it. The second group of people for whom Zionists became an answer are those who wanted to assimilate. They wanted to change identities. They felt that liberation from Jewish religion meant also joining the forces of Western Enlightenment. And they sometimes realized that they were trying to move from one thick identity, Jewish and humanist and general and universal, to another thick identity like French or German or British. And they were willing to privatize their Judaism, to be Jews in their homes and faithful Germans, Englishmen, French outside. And many of them realized that this was not possible. So all of these groups of people converged on thinking that a solution to contemporary problems of Jews and Judaism, not only Jews, not only Judaism, is a Jewish state.